I'd like to invite you guys to stand. We're going to start by reading a word of Scripture. This from Matthew chapter 9, verses 14 to 17. I'll read, and you can just follow along, reading in your heads, and then we'll get to the end, and I'll say, "This is the word of the Lord," and you can respond saying, "Thanks be to God." Then John's disciples came and asked him, Jesus, "How is it that we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast?" Jesus answered, "How can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he is still with them? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. Then they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse. Neither do people pour new wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst. The wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved." This is the word of the Lord. You guys can be seated. So keep that passage in mind for a little while, and I'll get through some introductory things. How many of you have an all-time favorite pair of blue jeans? Anybody? And I see some nods and some, yeah, all right. These are the ones that you have loved them so much. They fit you so right in all the right places. And so you go in them. You go everywhere in them. And then what happens is you wore them so much that you wore them out. So you started just wearing them around the house, right? But then eventually you get nervous that even around the house, they're just going to eventually unravel off you. I mean, you're wearing these babies because you love them so much. Eventually, they just can't even be worn around the house anymore. And all you can do is put them on a shelf because you just can't get rid of them. No way. Put them on a shelf, and they're going to be passed down to somebody in an inheritance someday or something like that. Or maybe like turned into a museum. Try to pass them off as the world's greatest pair of blue jeans of all time. Something like that. Like an old Cat Stevens song. I like this. Talking about the denim blue faded up to the sky. Although you want them to last forever, you know they never will. You know they never will. And the patches make the goodbye harder still. You had a pair of blue jeans like that. Or maybe it's not a pair of blue jeans. In high school, I knew a guy, he was on our basketball team, and he had this favorite t-shirt, this plain white t-shirt, but it had been so worn that you could practically see his chest, through his white t-shirt. And the collar was basically hanging on by just some threads on the sides. And in fact, guys will be guys, right? We had, just to bother him, kind of a little wrestling match, and we ended up tearing the collar off of his favorite t-shirt. But he nevertheless, that night when it came bedtime, he still wore that t-shirt and he put the collar on separate. He just loved that t-shirt. We get this way about things. Oh, here's one. Maybe some of you are like this. You can't stand changing your cell phone. Yeah, right? Because you know that you're going to have to get used to some different things with the new cell phone, and they're new things, and what once was comfortable and easy at the edge of your fingers there now will require thought and effort. It's change. Doesn't matter if the new phone is better. Doesn't matter if it's not just a smartphone. Maybe it's a genius phone. Maybe this new phone makes breakfast in the morning. There is no app for that, but we're aiming at it. If it requires change, we're hesitant. We resist. As human beings, it is universal to resist change. We're in a sermon series we've been calling Ecclesia, what the church is about. And we've been looking at some of the things that we are really about as the church. Ecclesia, of course, again, is the Greek word for church. It literally means the called out ones. We are the people who are called out of the broken ways of the world and into the humble, peaceful, self-sacrificing, loving way of Christ. And we've been going through this list, seeing many things, but I've been adding to this list as we've gone along. Here's kind of a rundown of the things that we've seen. Here's the one that every week, no matter what, every week I repeat this one. Church is about who we are as a people together. It's not something we do or someplace where we go on Sundays. Church is who we are. We are the church. Someday, who knows what happens? The government might come and take away our building. I saw that happen for people in Cuba. Their building was taken from them, and they were still the church. Don't count out something crazy like that. Church is about God, not us. It is about God's redemptive power at work in creation. It's not about us or what we can do or what we can accomplish or even what we want. It's about God and God's mission and the way God brings about things through us, making use of us. Church is about bearing faithful witness to Jesus, reflecting Christ's likeness. Church is about discipleship. It's about community. It's not about implementing the right techniques to draw people in from the outside, in through the doors. Instead, it's about trusting in, again, that humble, peaceful, self-sacrificing, loving way of Jesus, and trusting that the way that God has given us to be His people in the world, that in itself will be something special and attractive to people out beyond our walls. Trusting. It's about trust, not technique. Well, last week we saw that church is about love, not being right. Because as we all know, you can be right and still be wrong. If we have all the right stuff, all the right answers, all the right doctrines, all the right orthodox worship styles and so many things, but if we have not love, the Bible says we are nothing. What a waste. So if I could take all these things here, and if I could smush them down, this is what I tried to do. I tried to synthesize this maybe into one encompassing phrase this morning. This is what I came up with. And you might be able to do better, but this is what I got. Church, no, that's not it. Sorry, we skipped one. This. Church is about being a God-centered community of faithful witness, discipleship, and love. Church is about being a community, a God-centered community of faithful witness, discipleship, and love. And today's the last sermon of this sermon series. And next week we're going to do something kind of different. And then after that we'll enter into Advent and begin that preparation of our hearts, the preparation for the coming of the Lord. So this is the last sermon in this series, and if we can affirm these previous things, if we feel confident in what we've been through so far, then that makes this coming sermon pretty significant because you know what I don't see in this list? I don't see any prescriptions for required forms or structures or methods or models for being the church. There's nothing here that says that you have to have a temple, a building to meet in. There's nothing here that says you have to have these pews and that they have to be arranged in rows and that they have to face forward, right, where there's going to be a preacher, probably a white male. There's nothing that says that we've got to sing 4 songs, take an offering, and then hear a sermon. And then if your preacher's not too long, sing one more at the end. They're not requirements. They're lovely. The way we do this is perfectly right. But it's not the only way. So the sermon topic for today, and again, we've been, all of these statements have, it's about this and not this. It's about this and not this. This is our topic for today. Church is about what needs to happen, not what we've always done. Church is about what needs to happen, not what we've always done. It's about what needs to happen so that there will continue to be a God-centered community of faithful witness, discipleship, and love in the world. It's not about maintaining traditions or institutions, as lovely as they are and as much as we cherish them. So, it's been about, 11 months now. You remember last January and February, we did something significant together. And part of what is so significant about what we did together is simply that we did something different. And that's no small feat for a church. I'm not kidding. If you were there, then if you weren't there, then what we did was we had something called table church, right? And instead of meeting in here, we met in the fellowship hall around round tables, and we had interactive discussion, and we engaged with one another and did activities together for learning. And then, in fact, we did it again in September. But doing something that different is really significant in the life of a church. And in fact, I get together with all these pastors. You know this is Church Row out here, right? And there's like 9 or something churches that go along that way. And we get together all as pastors, and all my friends, they thought we were crazy. Thought I was crazy for leading you into something as different as what we did. And now, some of you loved it, and some of you loved it a lot less, right? But it was actually, it was the conversations that I had after those couple of months of table church that have led us to this sermon series here this morning, or that we've been through in these last weeks. Because one of the things that kept being said to me was, Pastor, you know what, this fellowship hall thing around the tables, it's okay, it's pretty good, but you know what? It just doesn't feel like church. And so if there's any pastor or a pastoral staff that has a pretty good ecclesiology, then at that point there's little red flags going off and a little alarm, beep, 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 warning, warning, something's askew here. Because if church is about God and not our preferences, if church is about being a people together, if church is about discipleship, community, loving one another, and if indeed there are no requirements about forms and structures for those things, then there is only making use of whatever faithful means are possible and available. In fact, even creating and innovating new and fresh models. And all this to ensure that there continues to be a people who are called out of the world into a God-centered community of faithful witness, discipleship, and love. So let's go back to the passage that we read at the onset of this sermon. I want you to see it again. I'm going to skip maybe just to verse 15. Jesus answered, "How can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he is with them? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. Then they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse. Neither do people put new wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst. The wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they put new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved." Jesus knew that his ministry was going to involve a lot of change. He represented change, and I'm talking big-time change. He was coming to a people who had changed very little for a few thousand years. I mean, that was the thing about the Jews that bothered the Romans, it bothered the Babylonians, it bothered the Egyptians, is that these people, they they just kept on being Jewish, right? They just wouldn't assimilate into the dominant culture that had them under control. They just refused. They kept on doing their things that made them distinct. They memorized scripture. They learned their stories. They practiced their traditions, passing on the faith in these very specific ways, generation after generation. I mean, these were the people who finally, after being freed from slavery in Egypt, they wanted to go back. The challenge of that change into freedom, talk about having issues with change. But Jesus knew that his ministry there represented change, and to staunchly change resistant people. So you have the Pharisees, right, they are highly religious, kind of law-oriented members of Judaism. They want to follow not the spirit of the law, but they want to follow the law to the T, to the very letter of the law. And then there's John and his followers, who are also, that's who came to Jesus. It was John and his disciples and the Pharisees came together to talk to Jesus at this passage and ask him this question, that why don't his disciples fast? And so you have the Pharisees, the letter of the law, and then you have John, who he and his disciples, they're out in the wilderness. And they're out in the wilderness on purpose, because by being out in the wilderness, that is a symbolic act that they are identifying themselves with a prophetic lineage, with a prophetic tradition. Which the prophetic tradition then is not about the letter of the law. It's about the spirit of the law and understanding what God is intending behind this, of justice and caring for the poor and equality and these kinds of things. And so you've got these two differing sides of Judaism that are two sides of the same coin, right? They are all still very much Jewish, and they approach Jesus out of this heritage of being a people that have been Jewish to the core for thousands of years. And they say, why don't your people fast like we do? The question there is, aren't you like us? Jesus gives them three images in his response to them. First, how can the guests of the groom mourn when the groom is with them? The point is that you have to look around and recognize what context you're in. Are you at a wedding? Weddings are for celebrating. Don't show up at the wedding and mourn. Recognize the context and act accordingly. It's a time for celebration, not mourning. And then Jesus, speaking of himself, also says, though, that the time is coming when the bridegroom will be taken away. Oh, and then they will mourn. Oh, then they will fast. Again, the time will come to look around and see the context. Oh, our bridegroom has been taken from us. That's not the appropriate time to celebrate. To consider the context. This points to this idea that there is an appropriateness to looking at context and responding to it, to take action in a way that corresponds appropriately to what we see around us. The next image, sewing patch on cloth that has a hole. If you take a new, unworn, unshrunk patch of cloth that has and patch a different piece of cloth that has a hole, but that cloth is older, it's already been worn, it's already been shrunk. And if you take the new cloth and patch it and sew around the edges, well, this one's already shrunk. So when this one shrinks, it's going to pull at the sewing job that you did and ultimately make those seams to unravel, and then it pulls the other cloth. Ultimately, it makes the whole thing worse, is what it's getting at. And lastly, there's this imagery of the wine and the wineskins. And in those days, they used to store wine in skins. Sounds weird to us, but that's how they did it. And you would take new wine and put it in a new skin, because the new skin was fresh and it could stretch happens in this process is that the wine releases gases in the fermenting process, and it causes what's inside there to kind of swell, and so it stretches the skins. And if it's a fresh skin, then that skin will stretch with its contents, and it will all be preserved together. But if you were to take a wineskin that has already gone through that process and already has aged and now is, brittle, that is now brittle, and put new wine in it, then when it releases those gases and that new wine starts to stretch, there's no stretching for that old wineskin, and it'll burst. And everything will be lost, spoiling both the skin and the wine. And so what Jesus is saying here, to different kinds of Jews, but to a people that are at every turn, they don't do well with shifting things up a bit. What Jesus is saying to them is that I represent change. Change is coming. And the wise person looks out at the changing world and finds ways to engage what's going on out there. It finds ways to engage that correspond to the new characteristics of the context, of the culture. The wise and faithful church does the same. For the sake of the world and also for its own sake. When pastors talk about change, the people get nervous. Let me put you at ease. I am not about to announce any kind of major, broad, sweeping changes at Crossroads. I have no specific plans that will greatly shake things up around here. Take a deep breath. Most of you come to this church because you like it here. Most of you. I said most of you. Hopefully all of you come to this church because you like it here. If you come to this church and you don't like it here, you're weird. You like the vibe of who we are and what we do. You like the preacher just fine. You share our thinking that it is wonderful to have a diverse mixture of ages and ethnicities and economic status. It's a beautiful thing that we are together, and I'm glad, very glad, that you guys like our church. I like it too. I love it. But there is something that I am deeply committed to as a pastor and as a leader of a church. And I think every church needs to be equally committed to it as well. As a pastor, I am committed to a vibrant relationship with the triune God in my own soul. This is number one for me. Second, I'm committed to my family, to be an available, loving husband and father who encourages my wife and children in the way of Jesus. But third, and this is the one that I was really driving at when I started this paragraph, as a pastor, I am committed to doing whatever it takes to reach people with the gospel and to disciple people in the way of Jesus. And that means that if there are forms and models of ministry that better correspond to the changing culture, if there are different things that we can do to foster the discipleship of emerging generations, if there are ways and means that are better suited for the goals of the kingdom and the missio Dei, then it's important that we as a people are flexible enough to step into those ways and means. And people often put this into an age dichotomy, and that's false. It's false that the elders are fixated on rigid skins and young people want to flex and change. This is not the case. Let me be really clear about that. I've known many older people who have encouraged and fostered change in the church. And on the other end, I've seen plenty of young people who are rigid and entrenched in certain things. In fact, I myself, As a young person, as a teenager, I got interested in music because I wanted to be able to make music for worship. So I got good at church music. And I learned how to play on worship songs, and the whole point was to be able to play music in a certain way for the church. And I thought that would be the timeless new thing for the church. And not only that, as I kind of grew in my calling and realized that I was called to preach, then I started studying some courses, right, in theology and Bible, hermeneutics, exegesis, things like that, even just like sermon writing and preaching classes and things. And I wanted to get good at preaching, convinced that there would always be this place for the preacher. And there would always be this place for the musician, and these things would be firmly established and always there. And I wanted to be good at those things and cement my place in leadership in the church. These are the things that I'm good at and comfortable with. But if there comes a day in the church when preaching isn't the best learning method, there comes a day when me playing the guitar or piano or whatever ceases to be just what we've known it to be for so long, then I hope I have the chops to set those aside and step into something that is uncomfortable for me. And again, I'm not saying we're doing anything. I don't know what the future holds. And the different ways, who knows, ways the church will need to step into in the future. But I'm committed to doing whatever needs to happen to foster the building up of a God-centered community of faithful witnesses in discipleship and love. There are things that I read because I'm a pastor, and you don't have to read them. And you're blessed because of that. There is some boring stuff out there. There are sociological studies, right, that are made on the church and all kinds of information. Boil it down to a couple of things. It's pretty clear we have seen that church participation all over the United States is in decline, and especially so here in the Bay Area, right? Another thing we know is that the average life cycle of a church is about 80 years. Anybody know how old our church turned this year? 80. Exactly. But don't freak out. We are not dying. We are not making any plans to close the doors. Nothing could be further from the truth. But we have to respond to these sociological facts, and we have to be aware of them. Last Monday, I was invited to attend a seminar that Point Loma Nazarene University put together. There were about 12 of us. It was like a roundtable kind of thing, a discussion with our denomination's best sociologist, Dr. Ron Benefield. Anytime I get a chance to go and spend 8 hours in a room with Dr. Benefield, I take it. And so I was there, and we talked about a whole range of things. When you got 8 hours, you can talk about a lot of stuff. But there were these 5 things that in particular I thought were really interesting, because he said that when the church sometimes recognizes challenging times, there are these 5 outs that they tend towards. 5 outs, and I'm going to share these 5 outs with you. So the first one is the move out. This doesn't happen very much anymore, but this happened like in the 50s and the 60s when masses of people were leaving the cities and moving to the suburbs. So now churches were recognizing, hey, all our people are leaving, we're shrinking in size, all our people are going to the suburbs. The churches moved out and went to the suburbs. They followed their people, right? There's the move out. It's one thing. Or there's this one, even more dangerous, the keep out. right? These churches exist to remember the past. The culture around them, the neighborhoods change around them. They start to get uncomfortable with who those people are. And instead of being this congregation that's open with wide arms and loving and accepting them, they start instead like isolating themselves, becoming cloistered. They make it, instead of easier to come and participate, it's more difficult. If you're not like us, you're out. And eventually what happens is this church ends up being 5 people that are imprisoned, really, in their own closed-offedness. The keep-out method. Then there's the close-out method. And this actually is pretty respectable. In fact, I would say the Sunnyvale church did this. That you could recognize that this is going to take place, right? There is no way for us to return. We're too few people. Our facilities have way too many needs, millions of dollars of worth of needs. What can we do that could still be missional to close this out and start something new? And so the Sunnyvale Church of the Nazarene closed its church, combined the few members that were there with another congregation nearby, and sold the facility for a lot of money, because there's lots of money on property here in the Bay Area, and took that money and invested it in a New Start ministry. And so the things that we've been seeing with the Possibility Project are born out of that church closing. So it's beautiful. New things that are starting out of that. And so it's a neat way to do it. Then there's this one. There's the holdout. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing. Keep doing what we're doing, and we're going to hope that things return to what they used to be. Usually what happens is you bring in some young, sexy pastor, right, to come and do things differently. They look the part, they've got family. This sounds familiar, right? And this isn't a bad method. And what happens sometimes is that there's this little bump or things go. It, at the very least, sometimes prolongs the life of the church. But interestingly, this isn't a solution, or seldom, we should say, ends up being a solution. Dr. Benefiel said to us, there is one thing. There is only, these are 4 outs that are really common, but there's really only one out that goes anywhere, and it's to reach out. It's to reach out, to do fresh things, to start a new direction, to reinvent, to innovate, to find new and creative ways to express the timeless gospel to a new and changing culture. Only Reach Out has the potential for starting a new bell curve. These church sociologists, they talk about the life cycle of churches, and they talk about it being like a bell curve, because you start and there's like I should turn this way because usually we start things on this side. You start off and it's this movement, right? It's exciting, and so people are drawn to that, and it grows, and then you get to this stage where it's kind of, we are who we've become, and it's established and set, and then it tends to kind of level off. So it's about 20 to 30 years of growth, and then about 20 to 30 years of being right there, solid, healthy, and then right about that time, right about the 60-year mark, there usually tends to be about 20 to 30 years of decline, and eventually a death. And what they say, that somewhere along this bell curve, a church has to reinvent itself, has to do something radical and fresh that starts a new bell curve, to find a new way of faithfully expressing, because over the course of 60 to 80 years, the culture outside will not stay the same. We must find new ways of expressing what is eternally true. Now, again, I'm not proposing any new specific thing for you here today in the near future. Today's sermon is just a reminder that it's not about our preferences or the things we've grown accustomed to. We have to make sure that we don't make golden calves of our wineskins. Yeah. Totally. Mixed metaphor. That's the kind of thing we do in the new culture of church worship. Our current forms and models of ministry as wineskins, they need to remain flexible. It's about what needs to happen, not the way it's always been done. I want to read this quote. A gentleman named William Easom. He wrote a book called Dancing with Dinosaurs. He was a pastor and a church developer, has written several books on church development. And by the way, this was written in 1993. So it's already, what's that? 25 or something years old, almost 25, 24 years old. He is now 78. So at the time of writing this, he was, what's that make him? Oh man, Sunday morning, what are we doing math for? I should have figured all this out ahead of time. But there is a warning, this is a warning to churches that look to the past and ignore the transitional signs all around them. God is calling us to find new ways to apply the good news to a new emerging world. Our churches often fail to quench the thirst of a spiritually dehydrated world. Churches with a slow pace of change are no longer adequate in a fast-changing world. Structures designed to coordinate ministry are unable to cause innovation. Ministries that worked in the industrial society no longer meet the spiritual needs of people in an informational society. In an age of computers, we cannot express truth in the language of a chariot age. The time has come for new wineskins. But check this out. This one from Dr. William Barclay, one of the 20th century's greatest biblicists. This was written in 1954. Figure out how long ago that was. To put Jesus' word, he's talking about Jesus' words in what he spoke about the wine and the wineskins. To put Jesus' words into contemporary terms, which are now already more than 50 years old, 60-something years old, our minds must be elastic enough to receive and contain new ideas. The history of progress is the history of the overcoming of the prejudices of the shut mind. Every new idea has had to battle for its existence against the instinctive opposition of the human mind. Within the church, this resentment of the new is chronic, and the attempt to pour new things into old molds is almost universal. It so happens that we are living in a changing and expanding world. It is Jesus' warning that the church dare not be the only institution which lives in the past. I thank God that you guys aren't this way. Oh man, you have blessed me as your leader with a whole lot of leeway. I appreciate it. It's still worthwhile to have this reminder. You guys have allowed us to try things, to try the table church, for example. It's an experiment that corresponds to a far more applicable way for learning and teaching in our society. The people in our society tend to engage with that method of learning far more than they could sit and listen to me talk for now 35 minutes. I appreciate that you've allowed us to explore that. I can't say we're ready to do that full time. We'll probably still do this. I do believe it's a better model, but it takes a lot of work, as it turns out, and we'll continue to do it from time to time. Last week, you heard Brandon share for a minute about the co-working space. This is another something new that we're given a shot at. We live in a place where there are entrepreneurs, a lot of people who work. You see them in coffee shops with their computers open, and we have space midweek that if we could develop a network of believers or Christian people, and then even invite some maybe who aren't into that context, but allow there to be this space where the sacred space of our facility is speaking into the kinds of businesses that they're thinking up, and if they can network together, and if we can use that time there also to be engaged with them them in discipleship and connect and intersect that place where their work might become for them an expression of their faith, where work becomes worship, then this is a possible thing for us to actually disciple people in their workplace as it's here. And there are other things. The district has encouraged pastors and staff to start other kinds of discipleship ministries out and beyond the walls of our facilities. To start small groups of spiritual formation out where people have their lives in coffee shops, people's homes, or wherever. I've heard of some really interesting things. I have a friend, he's not Nazarene, you'll understand why. I have a friend who has started a worship service at a winery, like in the Auburn area, at a winery, and they invite people, and they come, and they have Bible study, and then afterwards they share a glass of wine together. And it's an interesting way of engaging people in faith. I have another friend who has recently moved to our district in leadership, but has wrote a book called Edison Churches. Edison because Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, and he just couldn't imagine in a world where we knew about electricity that we would still be using candles, right? And he failed time and time and time again. I don't know how many hundreds of times he failed in making a light bulb, but ultimately got one that would stick. And so this book kind of chronicles the development of, I think it's about 9 churches that are doing something really, really different, but that's catching and that's interesting. In fact, the Possibilities Project is one of those that's highlighted in the book. And all of these things that are out and about, these may be things, we may connect with people that never actually step in here and join us for what we have come to love in our traditional worship services. We may be just discipling them in the places where they are. If we're to start a new bell curve in the life of our church, some kind of shift, an innovation, a reinvention of who we are, it's going to happen. And it may be multiple shifts. For reasons I don't have time to go into, new Christians or returning Christians often don't necessarily want to return to traditional worship services. So the question becomes then, in a new and changing culture where people seem disinterested in traditional church settings, what are the new forms and models of ministry that will help us continue to create God-centered community of faithful witness, discipleship, and love? What are those things? Is there as Dr. Barkley said, is there an elasticity of the mind that will allow us as a people to try things? Is there permission to invest and fail and give something else a shot and fall, but to keep trying and discover creative and innovative new ways? Because the goal isn't to return Crossroads to its former glory of the 80s when the place was bursting at the seams with people. The goal is to ensure that we are faithfully stepping into whatever means of mission we have available to us to reach people and engage them in the God-centered community of faithful witness, discipleship, and love. It's about whatever needs to happen for the sake of the kingdom and for God's mission, not the things that we've been doing necessarily for a long time. Again, I'm not proposing any big changes. I don't know what these things will be that we step into whenever they arise. I am only today urging us with Christ that we be open to new forms and new expressions, new models of ministry that will be available, and inviting us to be a flexible people, a new wineskin for the sake of Christ's always new wine. Claudette, would you come and lead us in a closing song?